Welcome everyone again to Preparing for an Annual Recertification Webinar. As Becca said, I'm Melissa James. I'm one of 4 resource specialists with the Insurance Services Office and the CRS program. I recognize many of my CRS coordinators that I work with on today's webinar, so I'm glad there's some new faces around here as well. I'm going to be helping you guys understand what a recertification is all about. We're going to go through the steps of the recert process. And more importantly, we're going to give you some helpful tips on how to prepare, how to submit one correctly. And I know a lot of people are like, how can I do this and be more efficient with my time? Maybe some of you are new. Maybe some of you have never done this before. So we're going to do as much as we can to get you up to speed so you're not stressed out. Again, Scott Copewood's on the line as well. He's one of our gurus that we definitely work closely with. So we're excited that you're here. And as you guys know, we had an addendum to the coordinator's manual. We'll go further into this later in the webinar, but so don't worry about that. Communities that participate in the community rating system, they're known to have exceptional floodplain management programs that earn premium discounts for flood insurance policyholders. Implementation of credible activities is a worthwhile effort that makes communities safer from the risk of flooding. When your community joined CRS, you worked with one of our coworkers, the ISO CRS specialist, to identify and document all the activities your community was doing to earn credits. In order to maintain those credits and those valuable insurance discounts that come with them, your community has to report regularly to your resource specialist that you're still implementing all the same activities. So you'll do this every 3 or 5 years with the cycle verifications. Those are like the more in-depth audits. And then those years in between, you're going to work with your resource specialist on what we call the annual recertification. So an annual recertification, that's different than the cycle verification. We also refer to it as a cycle visit. A cycle verification is a full verification of every single activity your community is doing. If you've gone through one of these, and you have a lot of activities, you're submitting a lot of documentation. It involves a visit from your specialist that comes to your community, or during COVID, they probably did it via Zoom, and a review of all documentation needed for your CRS program. Again, these cycle verification visits are done every 3 to 5 years, depending on your class and total insurance discount. So the annual recertification, again, it's a yearly check-in to confirm that you're continuing outreach. Are you publicizing the services that you provide? You know, like, hey, we offer firm information. We can give you property protection advice. Are you continuing to prepare those annual progress reports based off your plans? Are you still doing maintenance on your drainage system between cycles? Recertifications require much less documentation than your cycle verifications do. And I want to repeat that. They require much less documentation. So don't think you have to give us every single thing. So that's because that stresses a lot of people out, and we don't want to stress you out. The annual recertification only requires documentation over the period of time since your last recertification or your cycle visit, whichever came last. In either case, it's usually about a year. We call this your reporting period. And don't worry, because we know what your reporting period is, so we will always tell you what your reporting period is, and we highlight it in our emails to you. So between cycle visits, you may also do a modification to improve your CRS class. In just a brief example, let's say you've never had a hazard mitigation plan before, and all of a sudden you get one, you adopt it, FEMA accepts it, and this could cause you to have a class change, which would give you a better flood insurance rate discount for your community. You go through a modification and work with your specialist on that. If you do a modification in a given year, though, you are still required to do an annual recertification that year. So like I mentioned, your recertification is the annual check of your activities. It helps keep contact information required and current. Communities may have a new CRS coordinator, and believe me, there is turnover in CRS coordinators, whether somebody's promoted, they retire, maybe they take a different position within the community. So it's important that, you know, we have current information. And CRS may assign a new specialist to your community as well, so we need to have that current information. You don't have to wait to update CRS, but the annual recertification is another reminder and an opportunity to keep us up to date if there's been any changes within your community. So the central review process, what is that? Our CRS specialists, they're busy throughout the year. They're preparing for and conducting cycle verification visits. They're attending your state floodplain conferences, maybe some local workshops. They're hopping on local CRS user group meetings. So we have a dedicated team of resource specialists to help you through the annual research process. Resource specialists are trained to perform thorough and consistent reviews of recertifications, and our favorite, elevation certificates. There's 4 of us, myself, Brad Arkins, Scott Laporte, and our newest one is Sophia Hackett. So how do you know when it's time to recertify? You're going to get an email from your resource specialist with their contact information and your research packet 45 days before your recertification date. So let's say you're a community that recertifies in the 4th quarter. If your deadline's October 15th, we're going to email you 45 days prior. We're going to send it to you on or around September 1st. If you're recertifying currently right now in the 1st quarter of the year, your deadline's February 1st, you've received our email December 15th of 2021. So how do you know when you recertify? That's always a big question. We have this on our website, crsresources.org. It's a great table. Find your state, look to see which quarter you're in. At the top, the blue row, that tells you your deadline. So if you're in the 2nd quarter, your due date's May 1st, you're going to get an email from us on March 15th. And if you're more of a visual learner, we have this lovely map. So you can find your state. I'm based in Louisiana. So for folks in Louisiana, they recertify in the 3rd quarter. Their due date is typically August 1st. And again, this is on crsresources.org. And just a little quick reminder, when you get our emails, please make sure you reply to acknowledge you received it. We need to not only track that for FEMA purposes, but we also want to make sure that the correct person received it and that we know somebody that from the community has received their research packet and they're working on it. So what does a recertification packet look like? Again, when do you get it? Don't worry, your resource specialist is going to be sending your research packet 45 days ahead of time. It's going to consist of a CC-213 form your CEO is going to sign. That's the form on the far left of your screen. They sign and date the bottom of it. The middle page, that's your program data table for you to update. And then on the far right is the list of activities that you're currently getting credit for. This list serves to let you know which documentation you're going to need to submit with the packet. And here's a tip just to keep in the back of your mind, or maybe you jot it down. Always hang on to last year's program data table. We'll get into that in a little bit, but always hang on to it because you need to refer to last year's in order to help you complete this year's. And also, I would suggest hanging on to those research statements so you always know every year what you can work on this earlier. You don't have to wait for our emails to come. It's just a good guide for you to see what you should be doing and what you should be collecting ahead of receiving your research email. So a big question is, okay, well, when will I not recertify? When is it not required? There's a few situations when an annual recertification is not required. A research can be deferred if you're currently in the middle of a cycle visit. If you're currently meeting with your specialist and they're asking you for a lot of documentation, there is no need to deal with a resource specialist because you're in the middle of an in-depth audit with your specialist. It can also be deferred if you're currently set up to have a cycle visit. So let's say you typically recertify February 1st, but you have a cycle visit scheduled in September. We're not going to have you recertify because you're preparing for a cycle visit later that year. We will send you an email to request your elevation certificates, because remember, ECs are now required every year at your recertification deadline, whether you're recertifying or having a cycle visit, but we will not have you submit other documentation. But let's say you just closed out your cycle visit. Your file was just recently closed out within the last 6 months. We're not going to send you a recert, don't worry, because you just got done with a major audit. But again, we will request ECs if you have any, those construction certificates along with the permit list. And unfortunately, there are times when communities are affected by disasters. And depending, you know, talk with us. If there's been a major flood event or other disaster, you may not have to recertify. So definitely speak with your resource specialist if that's the case. So let's go a little bit further in depth into your recertification packet. Again, the first item that you're going to receive, the first page, is that CC-213 form. Why is it called the CC-213 form? That's just the page number out of the CRS manual. Nothing fancy, but that's what we refer to it as. Again, this form lists out your contact information for your CEO. Please look over that carefully and make sure we have the correct email addresses. We are required to CC your CEO when we send out your research packet or when we request elevation certificates, when we close out your files. Maybe if we have questions, it's not to get you in trouble. It's just they are technically the point person on behalf of FEMA, and they're the ones that sign off on being in CRS every year. So we need to make sure that that information is updated. Also make sure the CRS coordinator information is updated. I had somebody last quarter say, I'm currently the CRS coordinator, but I am retiring December 15th. So they included the new person's information. So I had that for the following year, which was, I really appreciated that. So double check those email addresses. I know some people have had to, due to IT or security issues, some of their email addresses changed slightly. Make sure that you look through that to make sure we have it correct. And then don't forget your CEO needs to sign and date the bottom of that form. Again, view this as your annual contract. Your CEO, again, is attesting to the fact that you're still in compliance with the minimum NFIP standards. You still maintain those elevation certificates. You've reviewed your rep loss list in areas. You sent rep loss letters out. You're still earning credit under Activity 510. If you're a rep loss category C, which means you have more than 50 rep loss structures in your community, and that you're maintaining flood insurance on all buildings owned by your community in the special flood hazard area. This form must be filled out, signed, and dated by your CEO and needs to be submitted in order to remain in the CRS program. So just a reminder about that. This second page, some of this can be intimidating for new CRS coordinators. Don't let it be. This is the program data table. Here we ask you to update the number of buildings in your floodplain and the area of your floodplain in case either have changed from the previous cycle visit or your last recertification. Be sure to read the instructions that come with the form. We need all of column A filled out from lines 1 through 13. And column B should only be completed if it applies to your community. A lot of people ask about column C. That's optional, but it's good information to have. But again, that's optional. You're also required to fill out the fields in lines 14 through 16. Just note, lines 1 and lines 10, those refer to last year's program data table. That's why you want to hang on to last year's program data table. It's asking for what was last year's total of building count and last year's total of current acreage in the special flood hazard area. You're going to need those numbers to add on to this year. It's kind of like your baseline every year. You're referring to last year's totals to start off for this year before you can calculate the rest of your count. So that's why you always want to hang on to last year's program data table. If you have data for lines 17 through 19, definitely include those. Again, it's not required. but this form must be filled out completely and accurately, at least column A, lines 1 through 16. So let's talk about the research statement. These activity statements are usually 2 to 3 pages long. Please place your initials on the lines next to the activities that you're implementing. If there are any lines that are not initialed, we're going to assume that you're not implementing those activities anymore, and the points for those activities will be taken away. Sometimes people overlook that and they're like, oh gosh, no, we're still doing that. So make sure that you definitely initial by that. Please do not place like an X or a check mark on the line. We need you to initial it. Again, view this as your annual contract with the CRS program. So if it's check marked or has X's, we're going to send it back to you and say, hey, can you please initial by these? So how do you know what documentation that you need to submit? If you notice anything that's in bold that contains the word attached, that's how you know what documentation that you need to submit for every activity. So not every activity requires documents. So don't spend a lot of time on stuff that doesn't require a document to be attached, because that just creates extra work for you. And we know you got a lot, and some of you wear multiple hats for your community. So we definitely want to make sure you're only submitting what you need to submit. So like for a brief example, activity 350, if you notice on the middle of the screen, says we keep our public library updated with, flood protection materials, and then we also keep our website up to date with information. Neither one of those say that you need to attach anything, so don't submit anything. You don't need to submit screenshots from your library's site to show that those materials are on file there. You do not need to do anything like that. But if you notice for activities 320 and 360, or maybe you have a PPI, you're required to submit documentation for that. So in addition to certifying that your community is still implementing each activity, the activity statements will guide you through a list of documentation that must be submitted with your recertification. So let's go through these activities that require documentation. First off, it's important to know when you're attaching documentation, some people use a cover page between each one that says, hey, here's activity 320 or activity 360. Or you just mark it up in the upper right-hand corner of the first page. Most communities keep a log of people who call or visit their office asking for floodplain determinations. This is a service that's credible in activity 320, just to kind of give you an example. So you're going to want to write 320 in that top right-hand corner of the document to verify you're still implementing this activity. And then place your activities in order that they come in the program. It helps keep you organized. It makes it easy for us to find stuff. I know some communities, when they email me their stuff, they may send me a zip file, and they have it broken into subfolders based on those activities. That's great too. And that's even more helpful. It keeps them organized as well. And then just also remember, digital copies of your documentation are highly preferred. If you have to mail something, and it's rare that people are mailing stuff to us these days, but please do not send it signature required. And then always know when you submit to us, we will confirm receipt of your materials via email. We'll send you a quick email just saying, hey, we received your submission, and we'll get back to you. So let's talk about one of our favorite things, elevation certificates. For activity 310, if you had any new construction or substantial improvement in the special flood hazard area since your last recert or cycle visit, you're always going to need to provide the permit list, those elevation certificates, and all other required certifications like flood-proofing certificates, D-zone design certificates, engineered opening certificates. We need all of that if it's required since your last submittal. Your resource specialist will review them and provide feedback if there's errors or missing information. And always know that we have in-depth training videos on ECs and how to correct them in your permit list on crsresources.org on the website. So just a reminder, it feels like 2021 kind of flew by, but last January 1st of 2021, we had a new addendum that went into effect where annual construction certificates are going to be required at your recertification date every year, whether you recertify or have a cycle visit. So if you're having a cycle visit, again, we're not going to send you a recertification packet email, but we will send you an email saying, hey, we need any ECs and the rest of those construction certificates and a permit list to review. And again, we're talking about, here's an example of the EC, floodproofing certificate. Please make sure that surveyors and engineers are using the current forms because we don't want you to get gigged for that. And make sure that they're filling out all the fields for the V-Zone design certificate. And this is a simple error that a lot of people always overlook. If there's engineered openings, make sure the engineered opening certificate is attached. This is an example of one. It doesn't have to look like this, but this is an example of one. They're typically, 5-6 pages long. And here's another version of an engineered flood opening certificate. So again, starting last January of 2021, elevation certificates are no longer scored as part of your cycle anymore. You have to meet the 90% threshold every year when you have your recertification date. This is a Class 9 prerequisite. You'll always have 2 chances to meet it. If you get your score back and you unfortunately didn't meet the 90%, be sure you're looking at both spreadsheets because sometimes we include additional notes on our second spreadsheet that says, hey, here are some errors that you couldn't fix, especially without a surveyor. So just remember, every year you're submitting a permit list and your construction certificates annually. The number of ECs you're submitting should match up with your permit list. If you don't have a permit list, we're going to have you complete one to submit before we can continue on with your review. So again, what should you be submitting at recertification time compared to if you're having a cycle visit? Remember, at recertification time, you're always submitting a signed 213 form. That's what the mayor or your CEO signs and dates, a completed program data table. You're going to be initialing by those research statements, attaching any documentation for activities that are required. And if you have any construction certificates, you're submitting that with the permit list. And you're going to meet that 90% on the first try. And then if you're having a cycle visit or you just closed up one and we're just asking for elevation certificates, you're going to submit those along with a permit list at your recertification date. So let's get into more of these activities. Activity 320 requires you submit a copy of your publicity for the map information services you provide, along with 1 page of a log that you track these requests, a flood zone determination letter that may be sent out or emailed to somebody, or other record that you kept on the service this year. These are required. A quick example of a 320 outreach item may be you send a letter to your banks, realtors, and insurance agents that you offer this service every year. Or maybe you send something to your entire community. It needs to be something that is mailed out. For Activity 330, if you're not receiving credit for a program of public information, also known as a PPI, you'll need to prepare an annual evaluation. Your resource specialist will always send you a progress report template that's going to guide you through the required information needed. You don't have to use that template, but you do need to make sure you answer all the questions in that template. So for Activity 360, this is also another service that you provide, and this is where you provide flood protection advice to people who may ask about it. Some of you get credit for offering site visits. You'll go out to somebody's house or business to see what's going on and get a better look about it. And then some of you may also provide additional advice on financial assistance programs for people who may ask about it. This also requires an annual outreach. that either needs to be mailed to everybody in the community or it only needs to go to those in the special flood hazard area. People get Activity 320 and 360 easily confused. Remember, Activity 320 is where you're providing firm information, map information. What's your flood zone? What's your BFE? Activity 360 focuses solely on flood protection advice, but both require that you submit your annual outreach item and then a page of your log where you track that, and make sure your log for 360 shows what recommendations or suggestions that you gave people if they call in or if you do a site visit. Activity 370 requires that you prepare an annual evaluation of your flood insurance coverage improvement plan and document that it was submitted to your governing body. Don't worry, the governing body does not need to take any action. We just want you to show your governing body your annual report. Activity 370 also requires a copy of all outreach projects to promote flood insurance during the year. If you are receiving credit for providing technical assistance in your office for flood insurance, you're going to need to submit a copy of the outreach publicizing this service as well. So good news about activities in the 400 series. The only time you're going to need to submit anything is if you've amended an ordinance that you're receiving credit for. In this case, if you amended anything that affects CRS credit, please provide a copy and clearly mark the sections that were amended so your resource specialist can easily find it. And then we pass that along to your specialist to review. For the 500 series, let's first talk about rep loss requirements. I know a lot of communities have had trouble maybe accessing that. ISO no longer gives out rep loss data information due to privacy laws. We can help connect you with your FEMA region insurance liaison person who can, that's who you now have to request that from. If you have not received that information, please follow up with them again, let us know. But for your research, if you haven't received that information in a timely manner, use the most recent data you have. If that means it's data from 2 years ago because you're still waiting to hear from FEMA, let us know, but also note that on your research packet. And just remember, if you have rep loss properties, you're required to distribute an annual outreach letter to those rep loss areas. You need to submit a copy of that outreach with your recertification. If you have credit for a floodplain management plan or rep loss area analysis, we'll need to see those annual progress reports for each management plan or rep loss area analysis. And this is what it's going to look like. It's a very similar template to Activity 330 PPI. We'll send you a progress report template just like this to help you. The key parts are a description of how the evaluation report was prepared. So just briefly, because I think a lot of communities get confused on this, some things aren't going to change. Like question 1, where can a copy of your plan be found? It may be physically in your office. It may be on a website. Step 2 is where I find a lot of communities get confused on this. We don't need to know who prepared your hazard mitigation plan. Step 2 is asking who is putting this report together that you submit at your annual recertification. Are you working with somebody in code enforcement or at your emergency management office? And then you need to make sure it's an update of who's putting together this report with an update on all the action items from your hazard mitigation plan. So step 2 is not just who's putting this report together, but did you share this report with your governing body? They don't need to vote on it, but did you just share it with them, release it to the media, and make it available to the public? And then step 3, one of the easiest tips that I tell people, this is what I used to do in a community where I worked. We extracted our action items from our hazard mitigation plan. It was in a great table. We literally extracted that table. Some people may have it listed out in bullet points. You can do that too. But step 3, I would say if you have like action worksheets or if it's in a nice table, extract that, add a column onto that table saying 2022 status update, and let us know, is this ongoing? Is this, maybe you want to install a generator at City Hall and it's not complete yet because maybe you just don't have funding for it. that's one of the best tips that I can give people, and it's made it not so overwhelming to them to complete this report. And then steps 4 and 5 are asking, why were some of your objectives not reached? Or why is implementation behind schedule? And it could be for a multitude of reasons. Budgeting, a shortage of staffing. Unfortunately, COVID is still a big issue. And then you may have some new recommendations on new projects, or maybe have revised some of your recommendations. So that's one of the tips that I tell my communities that I work with to help them. And be sure, if you're part of a regional or countywide hazard mitigation plan, a lot of you are, check with your regional plan leader to see if there's annual progress report already been prepared for everyone participating in the plan, because that will definitely save you some time. The part of the annual recertification has significant consequences if not done properly, unfortunately. So failure to do the outreach letter, again, for activity 502 that involves those rep loss areas, will result in removal from their program, since this is a Class 9 prerequisite. And then failure to do the annual progress report will result in loss of points for your floodplain management plan, which we definitely don't want that to happen. And again, if you're a Category C rep loss community, meaning you have more than 50 rep loss properties, failure to do the plan's progress report will result in a removal from the program, since this is also a Class 9 prerequisite as well. Activity 540, this is drainage system maintenance. This has several elements that require documentation. Channel and debris removal, also known as CDR credit, requires a copy of one typical inspection report that shows maintenance was performed on the credited part of your drainage system. The same thing applies for storage basin maintenance, SBM credit. Reports should always include the date the work was done. It needs to be, again, within that reporting period of your recertification. It should also include the name of the person who did it and the work that was performed. For Activity 540 stream dumping regulations, you're going to need to submit an example of the outreach project you use to publicize these regulations. Something where I live in Louisiana, in the New Orleans area, they've got stickers all over the catch basins throughout town, and I know a lot of communities have this. They have that. They take a picture of that. You could submit something like that. If you've got a permanent sign that says no dumping, illegal dumping site, you can take a picture of that. Some people actually have a physical mailer that they mail out for everybody. That's another great example. Moving along into Activity 610, this credits flood warning and response plans. As with other plans in CRS, you're required to prepare an annual progress report, or in this case, what's referred to as an after-action report. So if you had a flood over the past year, a hurricane, a nor'easter that triggered your flood warning and response plan, you're going to need to sit down with all those involved and evaluate your plan and if it worked, maybe what needs improvement, recommendations for changes. If you didn't have a flood event over the past year, you are still required to do an annual exercise practicing your plan. In either case, you're going to need to provide documentation explaining the actual event itself or how the exercise was conducted, what date it took place, what part of the community it affected, what the extent of flooding was, lessons learned, and recommendations for improvement. These after-action reports need to be submitted with your annual recert. You're also required to submit a copy of the annual outreach to residents, informing them they will be warned before an event and what safety measures they should take in case of a flood. So I just want to reiterate this really quickly because I feel so bad when communities don't know the right way to do these reports. Again, you want to make sure it's the final report. A draft version of maybe a flooding event or a hurricane, we don't want the draft version of it. We need the final version of it. But make sure the date is always on there. Make sure if it's an exercise that you do explain that, or if it's an actual event, that's listed in there. there needs to be a list of participants. If you participate in your county after action report, maybe you all had a hurricane exercise, you need to make sure that you're signed in, because we do look at that to make sure your community participated in that. And then the annual outreach, this is a twofer. It's all or nothing. So you need to make sure, in addition to that after action report, that annual outreach item was mailed out as well, telling people again, like, hey, you need to know your hurricane evacuation route, or if there's a flood, this is how you're going to be notified. Sign up for reverse 911 calls. This is the station that you need to tune into. So we want to make sure that you don't lose credit, because it is a lot of points for Activity 610. And the same goes, we don't see a lot for Activity 620 and 630, but those are for levees and dams. Again, they are credited much less often in CRS, but they're still as important, and they require the same thing. They have to have after action reports as well, and we don't ever want there to be an event. So if there's not an event, make sure that you're doing your exercise and that you're submitting your annual outreach. So back to some quick helpful tips when you're submitting your research. The most important thing that you should be doing throughout the year is keep your specialist or resource specialist updated with your current contact information, especially your email address, where anything changes within your community. If we can't get a hold of you and you don't submit your research on time, your community risks losing its CRS classification and the insurance discount for your residents. And then we will also call, we'll call and track you down to make sure you're doing it or somebody's doing it as well. Make sure you know that recertification due date and when you're going to be receiving your notice. Go back to crsresources.org to write down when you're going to receive an email from us and when your research is due for the state that you're based in. And know that usually 45 days ahead of the due date, you're going to receive your packet. If you don't receive it at that time, please reach out to us right away, your resource specialist, and ask about the status of it. Here's a great tip that I've been telling communities. Set an annual calendar reminder for, hey, December 15th, we're going to be getting our research packet from our resource specialist, and it's due February 1st. Set those annual calendar reminders. Share it with your staff if anybody helps assist you. Share it with your consultants if you have any consultants that help you. And always hang on to, and you know what, start, especially around certain times of the year, especially holidays, it can get tricky. So don't wait till December 15th when you receive our email to start on it. You can start on it November 1st. I mean, you can really start on it earlier to start collecting stuff and doing your outreach so you have more time. And again, you should have processes and schedules in place to perform and document activities throughout the year. Keep a copy of your outreach, especially that required outreach, publicity, inspection reports, progress reports in one place so you can go along and then be ready to submit those documents digitally as soon as you get your research notice. 45 days should be plenty of time to collect the required documentation if the work's already done. Again, hang on to last year's program data table. Hang on to those research statements so you can go back and look at them and say, did we do our 320 outreach yet? No, we need to send that out like next week. So it's a checklist for you as well. Keep copies of everything you submit just in case something happens and either we don't receive it. You know, email can be tricky sometimes. Or maybe a file gets corrupted on our end. Again, only submit the required documents that need to be submitted. Again, look back at those activity statements. Look for those words in bold that say attached is or attached are. We don't want you to feel like you need to submit everything. So please don't try to create more work for yourself. And then again, mark up or somehow identify all your documentation you're submitting so that we know what activities it's for. The documentation may seem obvious to you, but when a resource specialist deals with about 100+ communities each quarter, sometimes it's hard to know what a community is sending out for certain activities. So it really does help if you write the activity number or the element on the top of those pages so there's no confusion and you get credit for something. And then if you've implemented new activities in the anticipation of improving the class, talk with your CRS specialist directly. You can always talk to your resource specialist and we'll connect you to your specialist, but if you don't know who that is, we'll make sure that you get in touch with them. That documentation be submitted directly to your CRS specialist and not part of your recertification. If you're looking for that modification, definitely reach out to your specialist and they'll let you know, hey, yeah, this is enough for us to do a modification with you. So if your research not submitted by your due date or missing the required documentation, you'll lose points and possibly a class or two. We don't want that to happen. So make sure that you're getting those CC 213 pages signed by your CEO. Submit those program data tables that are completely filled out. Submit the required documentation, especially those Class 9 prerequisites like the 502 rep loss letters. Because failure to submit that stuff, unfortunately, we would have to recommend to FEMA that you be removed from the program. And again, we don't want that because everybody's important and these are important insurance discounts for your residents now more than ever. And then definitely bookmark this website on your computer, CRSresources.org. If you have questions about your research or your ECs or you don't understand what you need to be doing, definitely reach out to us. The sooner the better. We're here to help you. We can definitely go through things with you. If needed, we can get your specialist involved to do a technical assistance visit to really bring you up to speed and in-depth on stuff. Just go to CRSresources.org, click on that 100 series tab, and there you're going to find our information for your resource specialist. And again, we're always happy to help you.
Thank you all so much for attending. We hope this was helpful. We hope to see you back in a future CRS Webinar Series session. Have a great day, everyone.